Close your eyes for a second. You're on the road. Day 7, maybe 8. You've lost count. 40 pounds of gear pressing down on your shoulders. Helmet, armor, tools, weapons, tent poles. Your back stopped protesting 3 days ago. Now it's just numb. The sun is directly overhead. No shade, no trees, just dust, and the sound of 5,000 men breathing in rhythm behind you. Your last real meal was... when? 2 days ago? 3? A fistful of grain, some stale bread, water that tasted like leather. Your stomach stopped growling yesterday. That's worse. You know that's worse. 20 miles today, 20 miles tomorrow, every day, for weeks. No supply trains, no villages, no relief. Just the road, the dust, and the weight. By every law of human endurance, you should be collapsing, starving, barely standing. And yet, you're not. None of you are. The Roman legions marched further, faster, and harder than any army in history. They crossed deserts, mountains, and enemy territory with almost nothing to eat. While other armies fell apart after days without resupply, Roman soldiers kept moving. So how did they do it? Let's establish what we're actually talking about. A Roman legionary on campaign carried roughly 45 pounds of equipment. That's not an estimate. That's from documented loadouts recovered across the empire. Armor, shield, pilum, gladius, entrenching tools, cooking pot, grain rations, stakes for fortifications. He was expected to march 20 Roman miles per day. That's about 18.4 modern miles. In formation, in full gear, over terrain that would break a modern hiker. And here's the part that defies logic. He did this on approximately 1,500 to 2,000 calories per day. That's less than a modern office worker consumes sitting at a desk. Now, compare that to Napoleon's Grand Army in 1812. 600,000 men marched into Russia. Within months, starvation and cold had reduced them to a broken remnant. Supply lines collapsed. Soldiers abandoned the march to scavenge. Discipline evaporated. Or take the Crusader armies we mentioned before. Massive formations that fell apart the moment their supply convoys were cut off. Men who'd survived sea crossings died on the march because they couldn't feed themselves. The Roman legions faced the same problems. Hostile territory, limited resupply, endless miles. But they didn't break. They didn't scatter. They arrived at the battlefield ready to fight. Before we go further, let's kill the Hollywood image. You've seen the movies. Romans feasting in camps, wine flowing, roasted meat, comfortable tents. The archaeological record tells a completely different story. Excavations at military camps across Britain, Germany, and North Africa reveal the same pattern. Grain storage, lots of it. Grinding stones worn smooth from constant use. Cooking pots built for boiling, not roasting. The diet wasn't glamorous. It was wheat, barley, sometimes lentils, bread baked over coals, porridge thick enough to stand a spoon in. Meat was rare, a luxury for special occasions or officer rations. The Roman soldiers' fuel was grain, plain, boring, efficient grain. And the question becomes sharper. How did a civilization this advanced, this organized, convince men to march across continents on nothing but porridge? The answer isn't one solution. It's a system. And every piece was more deliberate than it appears. Start with the man himself. Roman military training didn't begin with weapons. It began with the march. New recruits were drilled relentlessly, not in combat, in walking. 3 times a month, they marched 20 miles in 5 hours carrying full gear. Then they turned around and marched back. Not a training exercise, a standard requirement. This wasn't about building strength. It was about rewiring metabolism. The human body adapts. Push it consistently, and it learns to operate on less. Modern ultra-endurance athletes understand this principle. Train your body to burn fat efficiently, and you need less immediate fuel. Roman training created soldiers whose bodies had already adapted to caloric deficit before they ever saw a battlefield. But here's the detail that separates this from simple conditioning. They trained hungry. Rations during training were deliberately lean, not starvation, but less than comfortable. By the time a legionary deployed on campaign, marching on minimal food wasn't a crisis. It was Tuesday. Now we get to the food itself. Every legionary received a daily ration of grain, roughly 2 Roman pounds, about 1.3 modern pounds. That doesn't sound like much, because it wasn't. But here's what made it genius. Grain is energy dense. 1 pound of wheat contains around 1,500 calories. Compact, lightweight, doesn't spoil for months. Compare that to fresh meat, which spoils in days and weighs far more per calorie. The Romans chose the most efficient fuel source available to pre-industrial civilization, and then they distributed the burden. Each soldier carried his own grain, roughly 3 days' worth at any given time. No central supply column that could be raided or delayed. No dependency on a single vulnerable convoy. The food moved with the army, distributed across thousands of individual carriers. If one man fell, the legion didn't starve. But the real brilliance wasn't what they carried. It was how they ate it. Roman soldiers didn't feast. They grazed. Small portions throughout the day. A handful of roasted grain here. A chunk of hard bread there. Never enough to feel full, just enough to keep moving. This prevented the metabolic crash that comes from large meals followed by long fasts, steady fuel, steady movement. And this is where the system starts to reveal its deeper logic. The legions didn't survive on rations alone. They moved through the landscape like a controlled flood, taking what they needed as they went. Foraging wasn't chaos. It was organized extraction. Officers designated foraging parties. Small groups sent ahead or to the flanks. They gathered wild plants, hunted small game, requisitioned supplies from local populations. The Latin term was frumentatio, grain collection. But it covered everything edible. In Gaul, soldiers dug wild roots and boiled them into stew. In North Africa, they harvested dates and dried figs from abandoned groves. In Germania, they trapped rabbits and birds. None of this was survival desperation. It was standard operating procedure. The legion was designed to be semi-parasitic, moving through territory, extracting calories, leaving nothing wasted. And here's the critical point. This only worked because of speed. Stay in one place too long, and you exhaust the local resources. Foraging becomes competition. The land runs dry. But keep moving? You're always entering fresh territory. The Roman march wasn't just about reaching the destination. It was about staying ahead of starvation. Which brings us to the element that made everything else possible. Here's the principle that held the entire system together. Speed solved the food problem. A static army needs supply lines, convoys, storage, protection for those convoys. It becomes a logistical nightmare. A moving army lives off the land as it passes through. The Romans understood this at a strategic level that no other ancient civilization matched. Their roads are famous, 250,000 miles of paved highways across the empire. But those roads weren't built for trade. They were built for this, for moving legions at maximum sustainable speed. 20 miles per day wasn't arbitrary. It was the optimal balance, fast enough to cover ground and access new resources, slow enough to maintain formation and avoid exhaustion. And here's where the math becomes terrifying. A Roman legion could deploy from Italy to the Rhine frontier in under 30 days. That's over 600 miles. Through the Alps, with full equipment. By the time an enemy even knew they were coming, the legion was already fortifying camp outside their gates. Starvation never had time to set in, because the Romans never stopped long enough to starve. But speed alone doesn't explain it. You can march men into the ground, drive them until they drop. What kept Roman legions functional wasn't just physical, it was something far more powerful. This is where the system becomes something else entirely. Roman military discipline wasn't punishment-based. It was identity-based. You weren't a soldier serving Rome. You were a Roman. The army was the purest expression of what that meant. Discipline meant enduring what others couldn't, marching further, eating less, complaining never. The shame of weakness was worse than the pain of hunger. Every evening, after a 20-mile march, legionaries didn't collapse. They built a fortified camp, trenches, earthworks, palisade walls. Even if they were only staying one night, even if they were exhausted, even if they were starving. Because that's what Romans did. This wasn't enforced by officers standing over them with whips. It was enforced by the man next to you. If you fell behind, you endangered the century, your tent group, your brothers. Peer accountability is stronger than any written law. And here's the part that rarely gets discussed: the mental control over hunger. Roman soldiers were trained to divorce discomfort from failure. Hunger was normal, expected, not a crisis. The body screams, the mind ignores it. Modern military units still teach versions of this. SERE training, selection courses. The principle is ancient, pain is temporary, quitting is permanent. The Romans systematized that mindset and embedded it into culture. Step back for a moment. Same ancient world, same human biology, same logistical constraints. The Persian Empire moved armies by sheer numerical weight, massive baggage trains, thousands of camp followers, slow, vulnerable. When Alexander cut their supply lines, Persian formations collapsed. The Carthaginians under Hannibal were brilliant, but even Hannibal's army, after crossing the Alps, struggled with resupply in hostile Italy. His men foraged. They survived, but they never matched Roman efficiency. The Gallic tribes, brave, fierce, individually superior warriors in many cases, but they couldn't march, couldn't sustain long campaigns, couldn't feed themselves on the move. Caesar defeated them not by outfighting them, but by outsustaining them. He marched his legions in circles around Gaul, faster than the tribes could organize, appearing where they didn't expect, supplied when they thought he'd be starving. The difference was never courage, it was systems. So here's what actually kept Roman soldiers alive on impossible marches. It wasn't magic rations, it wasn't secret technology. It was a system where every element reinforced every other element. Training adapted the body before deployment. Rations were distributed across the formation, making the army resilient to supply disruption. Foraging turned the landscape into a resource. Speed kept them ahead of starvation and enemy response. And discipline held it all together when the body wanted to quit. No single innovation, just a culture that understood survival is a designed system, not a lucky accident. The Roman legions didn't conquer the Mediterranean by accident. They engineered the conditions for conquest. And the most brutal part, they made it repeatable. Century after century, legion after legion. Men who'd never met each other could step into the system and perform the same march under the same conditions with the same outcome. That's not just discipline. That's civilization at its highest operational form. Picture a dusty road in Gaul. Year 58 BC. A legionary kneels by a campfire. He pours grain into a pot of boiling water, stirs it with a wooden spoon worn smooth from years of use. He eats slowly, not because he's savoring it, because this is all there is until tomorrow. Around him, 5,000 men do the same thing. They don't complain, they don't question, they eat, they rest, and in the morning, they march again. That soldier couldn't explain the system he was part of, the metabolic adaptation, the logistical brilliance, the strategic speed. He just knew it worked, and that knowledge, quiet, habitual, carried in the legs and the stomach and the will, built an empire that lasted 1,000 years. If this is the kind of story that keeps you watching, subscribe, because we're just getting started. The next time you skip a meal and feel hungry, remember this. 2,000 years ago, a man walked 20 miles on less food than you're complaining about. He couldn't explain why it mattered. He just knew it kept the empire alive.